All right, welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive. And today we're going to be taking a look at a concept that's going to be pretty interesting here. It's called destroy from within, or the inner front strategy, and this comes straight out of the 33 strategies of war.
Yeah, so much of strategy that we think of is very upfront, right? You think of these grand battles, a clash of forces, and this one's very different, as we're going to get into today. It's more about finesse and almost encouraging your opponent to kind of, defeat themselves, right?
Yeah. I think the basic idea here and why we're going to be diving into this destroy from within strategy is that a house divided against itself cannot stand, right?
Hmm.
And so much of achieving victory or achieving your goals is not about a direct confrontation, but about encouraging the elements within a system to turn on one another, right?
Mm.
To bring about the weakening of an opposing force, whether that's a business rival or a political movement or even an entire nation.
Yeah, we're going to see it all levels today.
Yeah, right. We're going to look at it from the micro all the way up to the macro.
Right.
And, in this deep dive today, we're going to be looking at excerpts explaining and illustrating this specific strategy.
Yeah.
But the mission here is to really understand the power of this strategy and how it manifests in various contexts. And ultimately, I think what we're trying to do is give you a different lens through which to view conflict and competition in general, right?
Absolutely.
So to start, I guess, like, why is this indirect way of going about things so effective? Why is it so much better sometimes than just a direct confrontation?
Well, I mean, it really comes down to, I think at its core is efficiency, right?
Yeah.
And saving yourself a lot of risk. If you think about it, direct confrontation usually involves a massive investment of resources, of people and money. Um, and the outcome is uncertain, right?
Right.
Whereas, when you can shift that focus to internal dynamics, you're tapping into an energy that already exists within the opposing system, right? They become, in a way, their own biggest problem,
Yeah.
and it saves you immense effort and potential loss. You don't want to go head on with somebody if you don't have to.
Right. Yeah. It's almost like it's like a strategic jujitsu move.
Yeah.
You're using the other person's own weight against them. You're not necessarily going to overpower them, but you're just going to maybe give those internal cracks a little nudge in the right direction, and they widen on their own.
Exactly.
And so what the book really emphasizes here is that this strategy, this destroy from within strategy, is really about if you can get an adversary to turn on itself, it's almost the guaranteed victory, right? It's like it's the surest way.
Well, if you can control the internal narrative, if you can control those, it, you know, the relationships within a group, you're essentially guiding their actions, right?
Yeah.
You're leading them down a path to where they sabotage themselves, and that's really the beauty of this. It's that manipulation from within that can really make an enemy come apart at the seams,
Yeah, right.
and they do it to themselves.
Right, right. And speaking of things coming apart at the seams, one of the historical illustrations of this strategy, of this destroy from within strategy that's given in the book is the fall of the Soviet Union, right? Can you kind of take us through that a little bit? How did that come about?
Sure, sure. So the book really, highlights the fact that, instead of going, toe to toe with the Soviet Union and engaging in, direct military conflict, what the U.S. really did was it pursued a strategy of supporting these anti-communist movements within the territories that the Soviet Union controlled, right? So this took many forms. It was information, it was resources, it was giving a platform to groups that were advocating for their independence.
So it wasn't like a direct invasion, threat of invasion.
Yeah.
That brought down the Soviet Union. It was more about
Well, no, not in those final stages, not how it ultimately went down.
right.
It was more about the strategy of amplifying these, very deep-seated internal pressures that existed within the Soviet system.
Yeah.
And, obviously the economy was a major factor. But, by the U.S. giving support to those that were critical of the government, they helped to erode the legitimacy of the regime in the eyes of its own citizens.
Yeah. I mean, so much of this sounds like it was really a battle of ideas and internal dissent that brought down the Soviets, right? It wasn't a traditional war, so to speak.
Exactly. The collapse wasn't primarily because of a military defeat. It was a consequence of what the book calls this, internal rot, right? The system just lost the faith and support of its own people. and they weren't cohesive anymore. They fractured. They disintegrated.
Yeah, yeah. And I think what this also highlights is that, a unified enemy uh, is very hard to defeat, right? If everyone's sort of aligned and working towards a common goal, then any external threat is going to have a really difficult
Mm-hmm.
time. But
Mm-hmm.
but what the strategy is really about is recognizing that if there's deep internal divisions and there's widespread dissatisfaction, the whole thing's incredibly vulnerable, right?
Absolutely. And that's really a key thing to take away from this. When you see, a united front, that's going to be a tough obstacle. However, an adversary that's weakened by their own internal conflicts, that's something that can likely, collapse with minimal external pressure.
Yeah, right.
You're not going to have to push them over the edge. They're going to teeter over themselves.
Right, exactly. And that's a much more effective way. You're spending less energy, you're spending less resources. And the book, it kind of goes into some of the principles behind this approach, right? Behind this destroy from within approach.
Yeah.
And the first one that it mentions is minimal resistance, and that makes perfect sense, right? If they're all busy fighting each other, then they don't have much time to worry about you.
Right, exactly. I mean, if all the energy within a system is directed inward towards conflict and infighting, there's less energy that's available to resist any external pressures or threats, right? They're too busy fighting themselves, and that creates an opening for you.
Right. And then another principle that I thought was interesting is the idea of this quiet, unnoticed victory. And I love this because it's like you're almost the unseen architect of their downfall.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the elegant parts of this strategy is that if you do it well, you can remain largely unseen, right? It appears that that the adversary's demise was a natural consequence of their own, internal failings, which can shield you, from any type of retaliation or frankly, even just negative perception.
Right. Yeah. No one even knows you were there.
Yeah, it's like you never existed.
Right. And then finally, the idea of this total domination.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, that sounds pretty absolute, right?
It is. I mean, when a system fundamentally implodes from within, you're left with this power vacuum often where, there's very little resistance that's organized. The core structure's crumbled, and that can pave the way for, a much more, a complete and lasting form of influence or control.
Right. And so, I mean, obviously this strategy is not just limited to nations at war. I mean, we see this, in all kinds of areas of life.
Absolutely.
The book talks about how it can be applied, in business, corporate takeovers, using internal influence to weaken competitors. Like, what are some real world examples of how this could work in the business world?
Well, I mean, you see it in a number of ways in the business world. You think of hostile takeovers. A lot of times that involves identifying vulnerabilities, within the target company's management or the shareholder base. More subtly, and I think this is where the book really shines, is when it gets into, corporate espionage. That might involve strategically hiring key employees away from competitors, right?
Oh, right.
If you can't beat them, hire them.
The old tactic there, right?
Yeah.
But it's not just about acquiring that talent, right?
Right.
It's about disrupting the other company.
Exactly. I mean, think about it. When crucial personnel leave, what happens? Well, morale takes a huge hit, right? And the remaining employees start to wonder what's going on. You're losing vital knowledge and expertise, and it creates, an internal kind of uncertainty and lack of trust. And that's where it really starts to weaken a company, and they become much more vulnerable to external pressures or ultimate failure.
Right. And what about in leadership and politics? I mean, we see this all the time, right? I mean, there's constant efforts to turn opposing parties against each other. How does this strategy manifest itself there?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of political strategists, what they do is they try to capitalize on any existing ideological or personal disagreements that exist within the opposing party.
Right.
And the way they do this is they amplify these divisions through, targeted messaging or sometimes even leaking information strategically. And by doing that, they undermine the opposition's ability to really come together as a united front and challenge their position.
Right. So it's like you're just, throwing a little gas on the fire and hopefully it spreads and engulfs the whole thing.
Exactly.
Now, and the book even gets into how this strategy can play out in your personal life, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it talks about, manipulating social groups by creating rifts. This sounds a little,
Machiavellian, right?
yeah.
Sure, sure. I mean, if you think about social dynamics, an individual might, gain influence by forming these exclusive cliques or, fostering rivalries between different factions.
Yeah.
Maybe they, position themselves as this neutral party, or maybe they subtly favor one side over another.
Yeah.
But by doing that, they increase their own power and their control within that social circle.
Yeah,
So
no.
it's very subtle.
Right, right. Now, one of the things that the book gets into is the role of social media in political division, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is obviously something we see a lot today.
Absolutely.
And it's talk about how foreign actors can use these online discussions to kind of sow discord within populations.
Yeah.
And that this is much more effective potentially than, direct attacks. So how does this sort of strategy manifest itself in the digital age?
Yeah, this is a really stark illustration of destroy from within, but adapted to the digital age. I mean, you think about foreign actors, they don't necessarily need to use, the traditional military force, or launch these, sophisticated cyber attacks to destabilize a nation. What they can do is create and amplify divisive content online, right? Spread misinformation.
Wow.
And that's what they do. They try to exacerbate the existing, social and political fault lines.
Right.
And doing so, they create this significant internal disruption, and it weakens social cohesion.
Yeah. So basically, it's almost like you're turning the nation's own citizens against each other.
Mm-hmm.
And then, it's much harder for that nation to act with unity and purpose.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right, right. So
Because they're too busy fighting each other.
yeah, exactly. So let's say, hypothetically you were to apply this strategy, not that we're recommending it, but what would be some of the first steps to consider?
Well, I mean, I think the first and most crucial step is to really understand your opponent, right?
Mhm.
Identify those weaknesses, those internal conflicts.
Right, yeah.
You've got to do the observation, the deep analysis. Where are those, internal tensions?
Yeah.
What are the grievances? Who are the key players? Without that, deep understanding, any attempt to exploit vulnerabilities is probably going to be ineffective and could even backfire on you.
Right. And it's almost like, you've got to encourage those conflicts to escalate, right? Like you're tending to weeds in someone else's garden.
Yeah. I mean, the emphasis here is on subtlety, right?
Right.
You don't want to be overtly instigating conflict because that, shows your hand.
Yeah.
The aim here is to cultivate an environment where, divisions naturally widen and intensify, and hopefully, without your direct involvement.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And speaking of that, I mean, one of the points that the book makes is that a united enemy is incredibly dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
That if a group is cohesive and they're aligned, they're going to resist any external pressure much better. I mean, that makes sense.
It does, yeah. I mean, unity, breeds resilience, right?
Mm-hmm.
When a group shares a common objective and they have that internal cohesion, they're far more capable of withstanding any external challenges.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's why the strategy often focuses on, sowing distrust and division as that fundamental objective.
Yeah. You got to break down that unified front.
Exactly.
And one of the examples that the book gives of this is Julius Caesar in Gaul.
Mm-hmm.
How did he employ this kind of strategy?
Yeah, so if you think about Caesar, his conquest of Gaul, it wasn't this straightforward, campaign against a unified Gallic nation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Gaul was comprised of numerous tribes, all distinct, all with their own sets of interests and often long-standing rivalries. And so Caesar was brilliant at exploiting these, these pre-existing divisions, right?
He formed these strategic alliances with some tribes while simultaneously engaging in conflict with others.
Right, right. So he wasn't trying to take on the entire Gallic territory as one massive unified entity.
No.
He was.
By carefully aligning himself with certain tribes and maybe offering them incentives or protection against their neighbors,
Hmm.
he basically turned the Gallic forces against themselves.
Yeah.
And it was this fragmented approach, right,
Yeah.
that allowed him to conquer them in smaller, more manageable pieces rather than facing this unified, Gallic resistance.
Right, right.
So divided enemies much easier to conquer.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Now, another thing that seems really important about this strategy is maintaining secrecy, right?
absolutely.
Because if people realize that you're the one that's instigating the internal chaos, then the whole thing could backfire.
Oh, yeah.
They might turn on you. Absolutely. I mean, if your role becomes obvious in stirring up division,
Hmm.
then what's going to happen is you're going to see those factions within that opposing group set aside their differences,
Right, yeah.
and they're going to unite against this perceived, external threat, which would be you.
Yeah.
So, maintaining, this careful facade of neutrality,
Right.
or even appearing to be supportive, of one or more factions, can really be critical to
Yeah.
to pulling this off. The internal conflict, it's got to be attributed to the actors within the system, not to your external manipulation.
Right, right. And one of the things the book also warns against is underestimating internal resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And it uses the example of Napoleon in Spain.
Mm-hmm.
He took over Spain, he thought he had things under control, but what happened?
Yeah, I mean, Napoleon, he vastly underestimated the power of popular resistance among the Spanish people.
Mhm.
And so, instead of engaging in these large scale traditional battles, what you saw was the Spanish, they turned to this guerrilla warfare.
Mhm.
Lots of ambushes, sabotage, just relentless harassment of the French forces all throughout the country.
So it's like a war of attrition, right? It's this internal bleeding
Yeah.
that he just wasn't really expecting.
Exactly. And this is where, persistent internal resistance, it might not be, a decisive military defeat in the traditional sense, right?
Right.
But what it can do is strain the resources, tie down, troops. And in Napoleon's case, it played a huge role, in his eventual downfall.
Right. So I think the key takeaway here is even after you've achieved an initial victory, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you fail to address or you underestimate this deeply rooted internal opposition, it can have pretty severe and lasting consequences.
Absolutely. You can never discount the power of a people's resistance.
Yeah, right. And so if we think about practical steps again and again, purely from the perspective of understanding these dynamics, we already talked about, identifying weak points and internal tensions. What would be some of the other practical steps to consider?
Well, I mean, I think another practical step would be to observe how conflicts can be subtly encouraged, right? So that involves having this keen eye for recognizing opportunities to amplify, existing disagreements or grievances. It might involve careful word choice, or actions that gently nudge the situation in a certain direction. But again, without directly initiating the conflict yourself.
Right. Right. And we talked about earlier this idea of playing different sides, right? So appearing to be neutral,
Yeah.
but subtly influencing the outcome.
Yes.
I mean, that's going to be a really delicate.
It is.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, that really demands a deep understanding of, the motivations, the vulnerabilities of the different factions involved.
Right.
So by strategically offering support or information to different sides at different moments, you can kind of, subtly guide the overall, trajectory of the conflict.
Right.
And make it work for you.
Right. And then, of course, there's the whole strategy of, misinformation, right? To sow doubt. I mean, this seems particularly potent. It can be really damaging.
Oh yeah, it's hugely important, right? I mean, spreading misinformation, it can create confusion, it can erode trust in leadership, in institutions, and it just exacerbates those divisions,
Yeah.
right? And the aim is to create enough uncertainty and doubt that it paralyzes them from making decisions effectively.
Right.
And that just weakens the system, right?
Yeah.
But the book wisely cautions against, blatant lies. Right?
Yep.
Blatant lies can be exposed,
Right.
and they can really hurt your credibility.
Yeah, absolutely. And then finally, we already talked about how important it is to remain unseen as the influencer of the division if you want to avoid a unified response against you.
Absolutely. Maintaining that low profile and operating indirectly, I mean, that's essential, for the long-term success of this. The
Yeah.
less visible your hand is in the conflict, the less likely you are to become a target.
Yeah. 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 And I thought it was interesting that the book kind of goes back to, the business world, and it talks about, um, this corporate espionage and
Mhm.
how hiring away key personnel can not only, give you valuable information,
Right.
but it can really demoralize the employees who remain.
Yeah, it's psychological, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you lose key colleagues to a competitor, that creates a lot of instability,
Mhm.
raises questions about the future prospects of the company,
Yeah.
and then you see this exodus of talent
Yeah.
that follows, and that's really what makes a company susceptible to external threats, and it just speeds up their decline.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess if we were to really boil this down,
Hmm.
I mean, this strategy, this destroy from within strategy, it's really about, uh, manipulating those internal weaknesses, and doing so in a way that you're not having to directly confront uh, the other person or the other entity. You're basically just trying to uh, lead them to their own self-destruction.
Yeah. That's a really good, summary of it. And the most effective strategists, whether you're talking about, warfare or business or politics, what they do is they focus on finding and exploiting these internal vulnerabilities.
Mm.
And by dividing and confusing and destabilizing their opponents from the inside, they're achieving their objectives, with a lot less risk
Mm.
and often, with a more decisive outcome.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think for anyone listening to this, the next time you're observing a competitive situation, it might be good to just, take a step back
Hmm.
and look at, are there these underlying internal divisions that are at play? Is there someone, subtly fanning the flames?
Right.
And I think it gives you a different lens through which to analyze these situations.
Absolutely. And you know, you should consider this in your own, life. I mean, think about organizations you're part of, communities you're observing, even online interactions, right?
Hmm.
Are there instances where internal factors seem to be more decisive than external pressure? I think if you think critically about these dynamics, you can get some valuable insight into, how power and influence really work.
Yeah,
So think about this. Think about the strategy and see if you can identify this in the world around you.
yeah, absolutely. Fascinating stuff. Really makes you think. Thanks for taking that deep dive with us today, and we'll see you on the next one.
Sounds good.